Sure, and after he's done fixing the yacht, maybe he can cure cancer and solve world hunger, too. Richard Graves said it loud enough for half the marina to hear, and the crowd rewarded him exactly the way he expected. People laughed. A few shook their heads. One man pulled out his phone before I'd said a single word. Standing there in my oil-stained work shirt, surrounded by executives who probably spent more on watches than I earned in a year, I looked completely out of place. The billionaire's CEO watched the whole thing without saying a word. Then Richard pointed at me and smirked. This guy thinks he can fix what the manufacturer couldn't. More laughter. More shaking heads. The funny thing is, I'd already spotted the problem. What I didn't know was that fixing that yacht was about to uncover a promise made to my dying wife years earlier. My name is Jake Sullivan. I'm a single dad. I own a struggling marine repair business, and a few years ago the bank was 30 days away from taking everything I had left. The ending of this story changed everything. Before we get there, take a quick second to join the community by hitting subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded between a fuel invoice and an electric bill. That's how close the end came to looking ordinary. One piece of paper mixed in with a dozen others. I stood in the office of Sullivan Marine Repair staring at it while the diesel smell from the workshop drifted through the open door behind me. 30 days. That's what the bank was giving me. 30 days to somehow come up with money I didn't have, or lose the repair yard I'd spent nearly 15 years building. The place wasn't much to look at. Rusted toolboxes, weathered docks, equipment that had seen better days, but every inch of it had been built with my own hands. After my wife passed away 7 years earlier, that yard had become more than a business. It was the thing keeping me and my daughter standing. Losing it wasn't just a financial problem. It felt like losing the last piece of the life we'd fought so hard to rebuild. I folded the notice and shoved it into my desk drawer before Mia got home from school. At least that was the plan. My daughter had a habit of noticing things adults thought they were hiding. She was 10 years old, smart enough to read a room and stubborn enough to ask questions nobody wanted to answer. The moment she walked into the yard that afternoon, she looked at me for about 3 seconds and said, "What's wrong?" I told her nothing was wrong. She didn't believe me, I could tell. Later that evening, after dinner, I went back into the office to grab a parts catalog and noticed the desk drawer wasn't closed all the way anymore. The foreclosure notice had been moved. Not much, just enough. I didn't say anything, neither did Mia. But the next morning she was quieter than usual. She kept looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. It bothered me more than the notice itself. Kids shouldn't have to carry worries that belong to adults. The following morning, I was drinking coffee before sunrise when a news report caught my attention. Normally, I ignored billionaire news. People like me and people like them lived in completely different worlds, but the headline made me stop. Billionaire CEO Evelyn Hart had announced plans to scrap her late father's famous $120 million yacht after months of failed repair attempts. The report showed footage of the vessel from every angle. Experts had failed. Engineers had failed. Even the original manufacturer had reportedly given up. The yacht had become an expensive embarrassment that nobody could fix. The company was cutting its losses and sending it to the scrapyard. I should have gone back to my coffee. Instead, I found myself staring at the screen. The news segment replayed footage from the engine room, then switched to a technician standing near a control panel before cutting to another shot below deck. Something felt wrong. Not emotionally wrong, mechanically wrong. I moved closer to the television and watched the footage again. Then again. A small detail flashed across the screen so quickly most people would never have noticed it. But I'd spent my entire adult life fixing boats, engines, electrical systems, and equipment failures. After enough years, patterns stop being things you learn and start becoming things you feel. I paused the footage and stared at the screen. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe every engineer involved had already checked what I was thinking. But the more I looked at it, the less convinced I became. These people weren't idiots. The manufacturer wasn't stupid. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was looking in the wrong place. I sat there for nearly 10 minutes, arguing with myself. I didn't know Evelyn Hart. I didn't know anyone at Hart Marine. I definitely didn't belong anywhere near a $120 million yacht. Meanwhile, my own business was hanging by a thread, and a foreclosure notice was sitting in my desk drawer waiting for me to figure out a miracle. By every logical measure, the yacht wasn't my problem. But sometimes experience whispers something your brain can't explain. The longer I stared at that paused image on the television, the stronger that feeling became. Finally, I stood up, grabbed my truck keys, and headed for the door. I didn't know what I was going to find at the marina. I didn't know if anyone would even let me through the gate. All I knew was that for the first time in weeks, I was thinking about something other than losing everything. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I had a feeling that yacht was about to change my life. The marina looked like a different planet from the repair yard I worked out of every day. $1-million cars filled the parking lot. Men in tailored suits stood in small groups drinking coffee and talking about a yacht worth more than I would earn in 10 lifetimes. My truck looked so out of place that I almost turned around before getting out. Almost. Instead, I headed toward the crowd gathered around the Hart yacht. The closer I got, the more convinced I became that nobody there would take me seriously. Unfortunately, I was right. Before I even reached the dock, security stepped in front of me and asked for credentials. I told them I didn't have any. They asked if I was part of the manufacturer team. I wasn't. They asked if I had an appointment. I didn't have one of those either. The conversation should have ended there, but a few executives nearby overheard us and decided to join in. One asked if I thought I knew something hundreds of engineers didn't. Another wanted to know whether I had driven all the way there hoping to become famous. A few people laughed. I ignored them and explained that I owned a marine repair business and only wanted a quick look at the yacht. That earned even more laughter. Then a silver-haired man stepped forward from the crowd. The others immediately gave him room, which told me everything I needed to know. He introduced himself as Richard Graves. The name was familiar. I'd read enough articles about Hart Marine to know he was one of the most powerful executives in the company. Richard looked me over and smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you're beneath them. He asked if I understood that the manufacturer had spent months trying to solve the problem. I said I did. He asked if I seriously believed I could succeed where they had failed. Before I could answer, several people started chuckling again. Richard didn't stop them. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it. Then he said loudly, "This yacht has been examined by some of the best minds in the industry." But apparently the answer was sitting in a pickup truck the entire time. The crowd laughed. That's when I noticed a woman standing near the boarding ramp watching everything. Evelyn Hart. She listened for a moment before Richard explained why security was holding me back. She barely glanced at me before shaking her head and turning away. Something about that bothered me more than Richard's jokes. Maybe it was because she dismissed me so quickly. Before she could leave, I heard myself speak. "Give me 2 minutes." The laughter got louder. I didn't back down. "That's all I'm asking." Evelyn stopped walking, looked at me for a few seconds, then surprised everyone. "Fine," she said. "You have 2 minutes." The moment security stepped aside, I walked straight toward the yacht and climbed aboard. Hundreds of eyes followed me. I could feel them. Engineers, executives, reporters, crew members, every one of them expecting me to fail. The pressure should have bothered me, but the second I stepped into the engine room, everything else disappeared. That's what happens when you've spent your entire life fixing things. The noise fades. The people disappear. All that's left is the problem. I moved directly toward the area I'd noticed on the news footage, and within seconds I found what I had been looking for. The strange part wasn't that something was wrong. The strange part was how simple it was. I checked it once, then twice. The problem wasn't buried deep inside $1 million system. It was sitting right in front of everyone. I glanced at my watch. Less than a minute had passed. Outside, I could hear muffled conversations and occasional laughter from the crowd waiting for me to come back empty-handed. Instead, I reached in, made a small adjustment, reset a connection that had been configured incorrectly, and stepped back. For a second, nothing happened. Then a series of indicators lit up across the control panel. A low vibration rolled through the deck beneath my feet. One system came online, then another, then another. The yacht responded exactly the way it should have from the beginning. By the time I walked back outside, the laughter was gone. People were staring at me with the same expression. Confusion. Nobody seemed to understand what had just happened. Then the engines came to life behind me. Not a sputter, not a temporary response. A full startup sequence. The massive yacht suddenly sounded like a vessel ready to leave the dock. Reporters immediately rushed forward. Cameras appeared from every direction. Crew members started talking over each other. Several engineers pushed past one another trying to get below deck. The entire marina erupted into noise. Richard Graves recovered first. People like him usually do. Instead of admitting what everyone had just witnessed, he immediately started looking for another explanation. He suggested the yacht might have already been close to working. He implied the repair team had done the real work, and I'd simply been lucky enough to touch the final piece. The problem was that nobody seemed interested in hearing it. Too many people had watched him mock me less than 10 minutes earlier. A few minutes later, after the reporters were distracted by interviews and camera crews, Evelyn Hart approached me alone. For the first time all day, she didn't look past me. She looked directly at me. Then she made an offer so large I honestly thought I'd misheard her. The number itself wasn't what surprised me. It was the fact that she seemed to believe money could fully explain what had just happened. Evelyn led me away from the reporters and the growing crowd until we reached a quieter section of the marina. The yacht sat behind us, humming perfectly, as if months of problems had never existed. She thanked me, then mentioned a number that honestly sounded unreal. For a second I thought she was talking about the value of the yacht. Then I realized she was offering it to me as a reward. It was more money than my business would earn in years, more money than most people I knew would ever see at one time. She delivered the offer calmly, like it was the obvious solution. Fix problem, pay expert, move on. But the truth was I hadn't come there for money. I hadn't even expected to get past security. So I thanked her and politely said no. The reaction was immediate. Word travels fast around wealthy people. Within minutes, several executives nearby had heard that I'd turned down the reward. Instead of understanding it, they immediately assumed it meant I wanted something bigger. A few started whispering among themselves. Others weren't subtle enough to whisper. One man openly suggested I was negotiating. Another said nobody rejects that kind of money unless they're planning to ask for more. I ignored most of it. People tend to believe everyone thinks the same way they do. The idea that someone might simply be satisfied helping solve a problem seemed impossible to them. Richard Graves stepped in before the situation could die naturally. He wasn't interested in letting me leave with my dignity intact. Loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he suggested that maybe the entire thing had been staged. Maybe I had somehow known about the problem beforehand. Maybe I had created this dramatic moment to gain publicity. The accusations were ridiculous, but that didn't stop people from turning toward us. Richard understood something most executives understand. If you can't control the facts, control the conversation. I could feel dozens of eyes waiting for my response. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him the truth. I said that if I wanted attention, there were easier ways to get it than driving across the state to be laughed at by strangers. I reminded him that nobody had invited me there. Then I told him something my father used to say. The repair doesn't care who gets the credit. It either works or it doesn't. The yacht was running. Everyone could see it. That was all the proof I needed. Richard had no answer for that. The crowd slowly moved on, but Evelyn didn't. She stood there watching the entire exchange with an expression I couldn't read. For the first time that day, she seemed less interested in how I fixed the yacht and more interested in why I was different from every person around her. For the next few days, I assumed the yacht story was over. I went back to the repair yard, back to overdue invoices, back to trying to keep the business alive. Life has a way of pulling you back into reality, no matter how unusual yesterday was. The reporters eventually stopped calling. The marina stopped feeling important. What stayed with me was Evelyn Hart. Not because she was a billionaire, but because of the look she gave me before I left. It was the look of someone trying to solve a problem she didn't understand. Then, 3 days later, she called and asked if she could stop by the yard. Her voice sounded different than it had at the marina, less certain, less in control. When Evelyn arrived, she wasn't alone. She carried a thick folder and looked like she hadn't slept much. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, she opened the folder and slid several documents across my desk. She explained that after our conversation at the marina, she had started reviewing old company records connected to her father. At first, she had been looking for references to the yacht. Instead, she found something else. The documents showed a series of private charitable payments approved directly by Daniel Hart years earlier. Most of the names meant nothing to her. One of them stopped her cold. Mine. I honestly thought there had to be some mistake. Daniel Hart had never met me, at least not that I knew of. Evelyn handed me another page, then another. The dates immediately caught my attention. They were from the same period when my wife Emily had been fighting cancer, the same months when medical bills had been arriving faster than we could pay them. I remembered taking extra jobs, selling equipment, borrowing money, doing everything I could think of to keep up. According to the records sitting in front of me, an anonymous donor had quietly paid a significant portion of her treatment costs. The donor's identity had been hidden from everyone involved. Before I could process any of it, Mia walked into the office carrying a small cardboard box. She had been helping organize old paperwork from storage. Hearing part of the conversation, she set the box on my desk and started digging through it. A few seconds later, she pulled out a faded hospital statement I'd completely forgotten existed. Attached to it was a letter from the treatment center acknowledging an anonymous contribution toward Emily's care. The dates matched perfectly. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Daniel Hart had been the donor. For a long moment, nobody spoke. I kept staring at the paperwork, trying to make it make sense. My wife had been fighting for her life. We had been strangers to the Hart family, yet somehow one of the wealthiest men in the country had stepped into our story without ever introducing himself. Evelyn looked almost as confused as I felt. Mia sat quietly beside me, reading the documents again. The question hanging over all of us wasn't whether the records were real. The records were undeniable. The question was why. Why would Daniel Hart help my family? And why had nobody ever told us? I wish I could tell you I thanked Evelyn for the information, put the documents away, and moved on with my life. The truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about them. For days, Daniel Hart occupied every spare corner of my mind. Every time I picked up a wrench, I found myself wondering why a billionaire I'd never met had quietly helped pay for my wife's cancer treatment. The money itself wasn't the part that bothered me. It was the fact that he had done it anonymously. There had been no press release, no publicity, no attempt to take credit. He had stepped into the worst period of our lives and then disappeared without leaving a name behind. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. To my surprise, Evelyn became just as invested in finding answers. A week after her visit to the yard, she invited me to Hart Marine headquarters to review more of her father's archived records. Most of the files had nothing to do with my family, but they revealed something neither of us expected. Daniel Hart had been helping people for years. Former employees described scholarship funds, medical payments, mortgage assistance, and emergency support that had quietly appeared whenever families were facing impossible situations. In almost every case, the recipients never knew where the help came from. One retired accountant told us Daniel considered gratitude an unfair debt. If he helped someone, he didn't want them feeling obligated to spend the rest of their lives thanking him. The deeper we dug, the stranger the story became. People throughout the company had known pieces of the truth, but nobody knew the full picture. Daniel had intentionally kept everything fragmented. One employee knew about scholarships. Another knew about medical bills. Someone else remembered housing assistance after a hurricane. Every conversation revealed another act of generosity hidden behind layers of secrecy. Even Evelyn seemed shocked. For all her success and intelligence, she was discovering new parts of her father right alongside me. More than once I caught her staring at old records in silence, as if she was meeting him again for the first time. But while Evelyn focused on understanding who her father had been, I couldn't let go of a different question. Daniel Hart had helped hundreds of people, maybe thousands. Yet somehow my family had ended up on that list. There had been something special about our situation, something specific enough for him to step in during the hardest chapter of our lives. Every answer we uncovered seemed to create two new questions. By the end of the week, I wasn't just curious anymore. I was determined. Somewhere in Daniel Hart's past was the reason he chose my family, and I had a feeling that finding it was going to change far more than either of us expected. The strange thing about Mia is that she can make friends with people who don't seem interested in having any. A few weeks after the yacht incident, Evelyn started stopping by the repair yard more often. At first, she always had a reason, a document she wanted me to see, a question about her father, some new piece of information connected to Daniel Hart. But after a while, the reasons started getting weaker. One afternoon, she showed up carrying coffee and admitted she didn't actually need anything. Mia noticed it before I did. That's usually how it worked. One day I walked out of the workshop and found the two of them sitting on an overturned toolbox, arguing about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs. Evelyn was losing badly. Mia looked up and said, "Dad, did you know she doesn't have a dog?" Like that was the saddest thing she'd ever heard. For some reason, Evelyn laughed. The more time they spent together, the more little things Mia started noticing. One evening, after Evelyn left, Mia asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Does she have any friends?" I told her I was sure she did. Mia didn't look convinced. "Real friends?" she asked. "The kind that come over when you're sad?" Kids have a way of walking straight through conversations adults spend years avoiding. The truth was, I didn't know. But the next time Evelyn visited, I found myself paying closer attention. People called her constantly. Executives, investors, lawyers, assistants. Her phone never stopped buzzing. Yet somehow every conversation sounded exactly the same. Necessary, important, professional. Not one of them sounded personal. A few days later, the three of us ended up having dinner together after a long afternoon sorting through old company records. Nothing fancy, just burgers from a place near the harbor and take-out fries spread across my kitchen table. At one point, Mia asked Evelyn who she usually ate dinner with. The question seemed harmless until Evelyn went completely quiet. She looked down at her plate for a second before answering, "Mostly by myself." Mia frowned. "Every day?" Evelyn gave a small shrug. "Most days." The answer hung in the room longer than it should have. I've noticed that successful people are often surrounded by crowds, but not necessarily by company. That was the first moment I wondered if Evelyn Hart might be lonelier than anyone I'd ever met. Something changed after that dinner. Not all at once, not dramatically. But the walls she'd carried around her started developing cracks. She stayed longer when she visited. She smiled more. She listened instead of rushing to the next thing on her schedule. One night, I watched her helping Mia with homework at the kitchen table while both of them argued over a math problem neither seemed interested in solving. The look on Evelyn's face caught me off guard. She wasn't thinking about the company. She wasn't thinking about investors or board meetings or yachts. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked completely at home. And judging by the way she lingered when it was time to leave, I had a feeling she noticed it too. A week later, I was cleaning out one of the oldest storage cabinets in the repair yard, when I found a metal toolbox I hadn't opened in years. It had belonged to Emily. After she passed away, I packed away a lot of things I couldn't bring myself to look at. Not because I wanted to forget her. The opposite, actually. Some memories were so powerful they could ruin an entire day without warning. I carried the toolbox into the office and set it on my desk. Most of what was inside was exactly what I expected. Old receipts, handwritten notes, photographs, warranty papers, and random items that probably meant nothing to anyone except her. Then I found an envelope tucked beneath a stack of documents. My name was written across the front in Emily's handwriting. I sat there for a long time before opening it. The letter wasn't dated, but I immediately recognized when it had been written. It came from the final months of her illness. She talked about Mia. She talked about me. She apologized for the difficult days and thanked me for staying beside her through all of it. I had to stop reading more than once. Even years later, her words still had a way of reaching places nothing else could. Then I came across a sentence that made me read the entire page again. She mentioned Daniel Hart by name. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. I read the paragraph 3 times. The name didn't change. Emily wrote that she had met Daniel Hart shortly before she died. Not once. More than once. According to the letter, they had several private conversations while she was receiving treatment. She never explained exactly how they met. She never explained why she kept it from me. All she said was that Daniel had shown her a kindness she would never forget. I stared at the page, trying to make sense of it. The woman who told me everything had apparently carried this secret to her grave. That night I called Evelyn and asked her to come over. An hour later, she was sitting across from me reading the same letter. The further she read, the quieter she became. When she finished, she slowly placed the paper back on the table. Neither of us knew what to say. The revelation raised more questions than it answered. Why had Emily met Daniel? Why had she hidden it from me? Then we reached the final paragraph. There, in Emily's own handwriting, was a single sentence that changed everything. Daniel Hart made me a promise. That was all she wrote. No explanation, no details, no clue what the promise actually was. Just those 6 words. For the first time since this mystery began, it stopped feeling connected to a yacht or a company, or even Daniel Hart himself. Suddenly it was connected to my wife, and I had a feeling whatever secret she took with her was waiting somewhere ahead of us. For the next several days, I couldn't get Emily's letter out of my head. I'd read it so many times I practically had parts of it memorized. The thing that bothered me wasn't that she had met Daniel Hart. It was that she never told me. My wife and I had spent years facing everything together. Hospital visits, bad news, good news, fear, hope, all of it. We never kept secrets from each other. At least, that's what I had always believed. Now I found myself sitting awake at 2 a.m. staring at a letter that proved there had been an entire chapter of her life I knew nothing about. Part of me felt guilty for even questioning her. Another part couldn't stop asking why. Evelyn became just as determined to find answers. A few days after reading the letter, she called and told me she'd found several boxes of her father's personal papers that had never been catalogued after his death. We spent an entire afternoon sorting through them together. Most of the documents had nothing to do with my family, but every once in a while we'd find another reference to Emily. A note, a hospital receipt, a handwritten reminder in Daniel's own files. None of it explained everything, but a picture slowly began forming. Daniel hadn't simply helped pay for treatment. He had spent time talking with her, a lot of time, enough time that she trusted him. Then we found another letter. This one wasn't written to me. It was written by Emily herself. She thanked Daniel for listening when she was scared and for treating her like a person instead of a patient. More importantly, she thanked him for something else. She thanked him for caring about Mia's future. That single line changed the entire direction of the mystery. Up until then, I had assumed the promise somehow involved medical bills or financial support. Suddenly, neither of those things seemed important anymore. Emily wasn't worried about money when she wrote that letter. She was worried about her daughter. By the time the sun started setting outside Evelyn's office window, neither of us was talking about yacht repairs, company records, or Daniel Hart's business empire. Those things barely mattered anymore. What mattered was understanding what Emily had asked of him and what Daniel had promised in return. For the first time, the mystery felt deeply personal. This wasn't about a billionaire helping strangers. This was about a dying mother trying to protect the child she knew she might leave behind. And whatever promise Daniel Hart made to her, I had a feeling it was still shaping our lives years later. Looking back now, I can't tell you exactly when Evelyn stopped being a visitor and started becoming part of our lives. There wasn't some big moment where everything changed overnight. It happened the way most important things happen, slowly. One afternoon, she stopped by the repair yard with coffee. A few days later, she joined us for dinner. Then she started showing up often enough that Mia would ask where she was whenever a few days passed without seeing her. Somewhere between the mystery surrounding Daniel Hart and the endless conversations about Emily's letters, routines began forming without any of us planning them. Evelyn started knowing which booth we always sat in at our favorite diner. She knew Mia hated mushrooms and that I always drank my coffee black. Little things. The kind of things people only learn when they stick around. Mia, of course, adapted faster than either of us. Children don't spend nearly as much time fighting their feelings as adults do. One Saturday afternoon, I walked into the living room and found the two of them sitting on the floor surrounded by old photo albums. Mia was showing Evelyn pictures of family vacations, birthday parties, and school events, while providing commentary nobody had asked for. What caught my attention wasn't Mia. It was Evelyn. She wasn't pretending to be interested. She genuinely was. She asked questions. She listened. She laughed at stories she'd never heard before. At one point, Mia wrapped an arm around her shoulder without even thinking about it. Neither of them seemed to notice. I did. The changes weren't happening only around Mia. I started noticing them in Evelyn, too. The woman I met at the marina had seemed permanently guarded, like she expected every conversation to turn into a negotiation. That version of her still existed, but it wasn't the only version anymore. She smiled more often. She stayed off her phone when she was with us. Sometimes she'd arrive after a difficult day at the company looking exhausted, and leave a few hours later looking lighter than when she arrived. One evening, she admitted something she'd probably never said out loud before. "I don't remember the last time I spent this much time in someone's home." She laughed when she said it, but there was something sad underneath it. The strange thing was that nobody ever talked about what was happening. Not me, not Evelyn, not even Mia. There were no dramatic conversations, no confessions, no discussions about feelings. Life simply started rearranging itself around this new reality. Dinner felt different. Weekends felt different. Even the house felt different. The loneliness that had quietly lived there since Emily died didn't seem quite as heavy anymore. I don't know if anyone else noticed it. I did. And judging by the way Evelyn lingered at the front door every time it was time to leave, I had a feeling she noticed it too. The trouble started the way most modern disasters start. Not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, not even in person. It started online. One article became 3. 3 became 10. Then suddenly my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The first headline claimed Daniel Hart had secretly favored me for years. The second suggested I had manipulated my way into Evelyn Hart's life after the yacht incident. By the end of the week, commentators were openly questioning whether our entire connection had been planned from the beginning. It was ridiculous, but I quickly learned something uncomfortable. People don't need proof when a story is interesting enough. They just need a version they want to believe. Richard Graves was never mentioned directly in any of the reports, but I didn't need evidence to know where the campaign was coming from. The timing was too perfect. Every article focused on the same details: Daniel's donations, Emily's letters, my growing connection to Evelyn. Facts were twisted just enough to create suspicion without becoming obvious lies. Reporters started showing up outside the repair yard. Strangers posted photographs of my house online. One news segment actually referred to me as the mechanic who inherited influence over the Hart empire. I nearly laughed when I heard it. My business account was still struggling to stay positive, yet somehow I was being portrayed as a mastermind. What bothered me wasn't what people were saying about me. It was what they were saying about Evelyn. Shareholders started asking questions. Board members demanded explanations. Every interview she gave created more headlines. Every statement she released created more speculation. One evening, she showed up at my house looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. We sat on the back porch long after Mia had gone to bed. Neither of us talked much. Finally, I asked how bad things really were. She stared out into the darkness for a few seconds before answering. "Worse than they're saying publicly." That was all she needed to say. For the first time since all of this began, I seriously considered walking away. Maybe Richard was right about one thing. Maybe my presence was making everything harder for her. The company existed long before I showed up, and it would survive without me. If leaving protected Evelyn's future, maybe that was what I should do. I didn't tell her that thought. I kept it to myself. But once the idea entered my head, it refused to leave. The next morning, another article hit the news cycle. Then another. Then another. By lunchtime, the accusations had become accepted truth in some circles. Richard didn't have to say a word publicly anymore. The machine was doing the work for him. Watching it unfold, he probably believed victory was inevitable. He probably believed pressure would eventually force me out of Evelyn's life and restore everything to the way it had been before. The problem was that Richard still didn't understand something Daniel Hart seemed to know years earlier. Some people can be bought. Some people can be intimidated. But once a family starts forming, it becomes a lot harder to pull apart than outsiders imagine. The letter was discovered 3 days before the board was scheduled to vote on Evelyn's future. At that point, neither of us was looking for miracles anymore. We were looking for answers. Evelyn had spent most of the week fighting shareholders, reporters, and board members while I tried to keep my business running and my daughter insulated from the chaos. Then one of Daniel Hart's former attorneys contacted Evelyn and mentioned a sealed envelope that had been stored with a collection of personal documents. Nobody had opened it because the instructions on the front were unusually specific. The letter was to remain sealed until both Evelyn Hart and Jake Sullivan had read the previous correspondence connected to Emily. Somehow, years before any of this happened, Daniel had anticipated exactly where the story would lead. We opened the letter together in Evelyn's office after everyone else had gone home. The first page immediately answered the question that had haunted me for months. Daniel wrote that he met Emily during one of her treatment sessions. What started as a brief conversation became a friendship. He described her as brave, stubborn, funny, and far more concerned about her family than herself. As I read his words, I could hear her voice. Daniel explained that Emily rarely talked about her illness. Instead, she talked about Mia. She talked about missing future birthdays, future graduations, future milestones she feared she would never see. More than once, she told him the same thing. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of leaving her daughter behind. The next section of the letter shifted to Evelyn. Daniel admitted something his daughter had never fully understood while he was alive. He worried about her constantly, not because she was incapable, not because she was weak. Quite the opposite. She was successful enough to build walls nobody could climb. He wrote that every year she became more isolated, more protected, more alone. People wanted access to her money, her influence, or her company, but very few seemed interested in the woman underneath all of it. Reading those words, I glanced across the desk at Evelyn and watched her quietly lower her eyes. Then came the promise. Daniel explained that during one of his final conversations with Emily, she asked him a question he could never forget. If she wasn't there to watch over Mia, who would make sure her daughter never felt alone? Daniel admitted he couldn't answer that question at the time, but he made a promise anyway. He promised he would do whatever he could to help, not just Mia, both families. Over time, he became convinced that the thing missing from Emily's world and Evelyn's world was exactly the same thing: connection. The final paragraph explained everything. Daniel never cared about the yacht. He never cared about creating a business relationship between me and Evelyn. The yacht was simply the path, the excuse, the mechanism that would eventually bring us into the same room. Years earlier, a dying mother had worried about her daughter's future. A worried father had feared his daughter was becoming isolated from the world. And somehow Daniel spent the rest of his life trying to solve both problems at once. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, but by the time I arrived at Hart Marine headquarters, it felt less like a business meeting and more like a public trial. Reporters filled the lobby. Camera crews crowded the entrances. Shareholders and executives moved through the building with the tense energy of people expecting a fight. For weeks, Richard Graves had controlled the story. Every headline, every rumor, every accusation had pushed the same message. Evelyn Hart couldn't be trusted. Her judgment had been compromised. Her connection to me somehow proved it. Walking into that building, I honestly didn't know how the day would end. What I did know was that Daniel Hart's final letter was sitting in Evelyn's briefcase, and for the first time since this entire mess started, the truth was finally on our side. The meeting began exactly the way I expected. Richard spoke first. He looked confident, relaxed, like a man already rehearsing his victory speech. He repeated the same accusations he'd been making for weeks, only this time he dressed them up in corporate language. He questioned Evelyn's leadership. He questioned her decisions. He questioned my presence in her life. A few board members nodded along. Others looked uncomfortable. What struck me was how little any of it had to do with the company itself. Richard wasn't really attacking performance or results. He was attacking relationships. He was betting that suspicion would be stronger than trust. Then Evelyn stood up. She didn't defend herself. She didn't attack Richard. Instead, she opened Daniel's letter and began reading. The room changed almost immediately. She read Daniel's words about Emily. She read his description of Mia. She read the promise he made to a dying mother who was terrified her daughter would grow up feeling alone. Then she read the sections about herself, the parts where Daniel admitted he worried she was becoming isolated behind wealth, success, and responsibility. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody checked their phones. For the first time all morning, people weren't listening to arguments. They were listening to a father. When Evelyn finished, she didn't sit down right away. Instead, she revealed something else. Over the following days, additional records had been uncovered from Daniel's personal archives: donations, scholarships, medical assistance, mortgage payments, emergency relief funds, years and years of quiet generosity hidden from public view. One by one, examples were presented to the board. Families helped through cancer treatments, employees saved from foreclosure, children sent to college. The deeper the evidence went, the clearer the picture became. Daniel Hart had spent years investing in people without asking for recognition in return. By the time the meeting ended, Richard's entire narrative had collapsed. The board members who had supported him were suddenly asking uncomfortable questions of their own. Not about Evelyn. About him. Why had he ignored the evidence? Why had he pushed accusations before knowing the truth? Watching it happen, I realized something Daniel understood long before any of us did. A lie can move fast, but eventually it runs into reality. As people began leaving the room, I looked at Evelyn. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She simply looked relieved. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed to understand her father completely. Not the businessman, not the billionaire, the man. And standing there beside her, listening to the conversations filling the room, I realized I finally understood him, too. After the board meeting, everything settled down faster than I expected. The reporters moved on to other stories. The headlines disappeared. Richard Graves was gone. Hart Marine stabilized. For the first time in months, nobody was demanding answers. Nobody was chasing secrets. The crisis that had pulled all of us together was finally over. which meant I had to face a question I'd been avoiding. What came next? A few days later, I started packing away the documents we'd collected throughout the investigation. My life before the yacht was still waiting for me. The repair yard needed attention. Customers needed repairs. Bills still existed. Normal life was calling me back. The strange part was that normal didn't feel quite the same anymore. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of how much things had changed. An extra coffee mug in the kitchen, a jacket Evelyn had accidentally left behind, a half-finished puzzle she and Mia had been working on together. Little things that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. When Evelyn stopped by that evening, something felt different. She was quieter than usual. Mia noticed it immediately. Kids always do. We sat around the dinner table talking about nothing important until Mia suddenly put down her fork and looked directly at Evelyn. "You're not going away, are you?" The room instantly went silent. Neither of us answered. Mia looked between us and frowned. "Because everybody keeps acting weird like someone's leaving." Nobody laughed. Nobody knew what to say. For a few seconds, years of loneliness, grief, fear, and uncertainty seemed to gather in the same room. Then Evelyn looked down at the table and finally stopped pretending everything was fine. When she looked back up, her eyes were shining. "I don't want you to leave," she said softly. The words weren't directed only at Mia. They were directed at both of us. And in that moment, every wall she'd spent years building finally started to fall apart. People always ask me what happened after the board meeting, as if life suddenly transformed into a perfect ending the moment the truth came out. That's not how it worked. Real life rarely changes in a single dramatic moment. It changes through 1,000 small moments that slowly pull you toward a different future. The first thing that changed was my business. For months I had been spending more time worrying than working. Customers had noticed, opportunities had slipped away. But once the chaos settled, I was finally able to focus again. The publicity surrounding the yacht repair didn't disappear overnight either. Word spread. New clients started calling. Larger contracts followed. Within a year, Sullivan Marine Repair had grown beyond anything I ever imagined possible. For the first time since Emily died, I wasn't lying awake at night wondering how I was going to keep everything afloat. Evelyn was changing too, not because she had won the board fights, but because she had finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her all along. For most of her life, she'd believed success was measured by growth, profits, acquisitions, and market share. Daniel Hart's letters revealed a different philosophy. He had built companies, but he had spent his life investing in people, employees, families, strangers, communities. After the board meeting, Evelyn began reshaping Hart Marine around those same values. New scholarship programs were created. Employee emergency funds expanded. Family support initiatives appeared across the company. Every major decision seemed to carry traces of Daniel's influence. Watching her lead became fascinating because she stopped trying to become the executive everyone expected and started becoming the daughter her father believed she could be. The biggest changes, however, happened at home. Mia no longer looked at me with the worried expression I'd seen the day she found the foreclosure notice. Children don't always talk about security, but they feel it. She felt it when our future was uncertain, and she felt it when that uncertainty finally disappeared. The fear she'd quietly carried for years began fading away. Sometimes I'd catch her laughing with Evelyn over something completely ridiculous and realize how much had changed. There was a time when our house felt permanently incomplete, like a chapter had ended and nobody knew how to start the next one. That feeling slowly disappeared. Not because anyone replaced Emily, nobody ever could, but because love has a strange way of making room for new people without erasing the ones who came before. As for the yacht, Evelyn made a decision that surprised almost everyone. Instead of selling it or retiring it permanently, she restored it. Every system was rebuilt, every damaged component repaired. The vessel returned to the water looking almost exactly the way it had during Daniel Hart's lifetime. Journalists called it a tribute to her father. Investors called it a public relations victory. They weren't entirely wrong. But to the people who knew the full story, the yacht represented something much bigger. It was proof that broken things aren't always beyond saving. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to look where everyone else stopped looking. The question people ask most often is when Evelyn and I finally admitted what everyone around us already knew. The answer is disappointingly ordinary. There wasn't a grand speech, no dramatic declaration, no movie-style moment in the rain. One evening after dinner, Mia left the room and Evelyn laughed about something I said. I remember looking at her and realizing I couldn't imagine my future without her in it. Judging by the expression on her face, she had reached the same conclusion. The funny thing about real relationships is that sometimes the most important decisions feel obvious long before they're spoken aloud. We didn't choose each other because of a yacht. We didn't choose each other because of Daniel Hart. We chose each other because somewhere along the way, life stopped feeling complete apart. Years have passed since then. Mia is older now. The repair yard is thriving. Hart Marine continues doing work Daniel would be proud of. Every once in a while, I'll see the yacht sitting in the harbor and think about how close it came to being scrapped. People still tell the story as if it's about an impossible repair. They say a struggling mechanic fixed a problem that experts couldn't solve. That's the version that makes headlines. It's also the least important part of what happened. The truth is, the yacht never needed saving. The people did. A lonely little girl needed security. A grieving father needed hope. A successful woman needed connection. And a father who loved his daughter enough to worry about her future somehow found a way to help all of us long after he was gone. That's the real story. Not the yacht. The family it built.